Okay, so good morning. Administrations, remuneration, getting paid, important topics. These are the themes that I want to cover this morning. I'll start by looking at the basic principles. And I'm really quite interested this morning in looking at the relationship between proposals, remuneration, and the committee, because I think remuneration in administrations by itself just doesn't make sense without looking at those two issues as well. And I'll be looking mainly on the arrangements for setting the basis for your remuneration, but I'll also be touching in a couple of places on the value of your remuneration as well, which of course is what it's all about. Move on from there to look at the post-appointment timetable, the key dates, and then I'll lift the lid a little bit on the committee and look at that. I'll move on from there to look at creditor classes. The crucial ones here are the distinction between secured and unsecured creditors. And after that, I'll be looking at the different flavours of administrations, particularly those that are running on one of the paragraph 52.1 tracks of Schedule B1 and comparing with those that are not running on one of those tracks. And then finish off by looking at the procedure for approving the basis of remuneration in administrations. So let's have a look at the basic principles. Well known, of course, it is for creditors to approve the basis for your fees. There are three bases, and you can choose any one of those or a combination of them. So they are time costs, an ad valorem fee, or a fixed fee. Second basic principle is that the law tries to set it so it is the creditors in the money who make the decision about the basis for your fees, the creditors who are most closely affected by that. The creditors may delegate that power to a committee, and creditors also have the job of approving the strategy for the administration, your proposals. And the last of the basic principles is that if you're going for a time cost basis for your remuneration, then your fees will be capped by your own estimate. And this is the diagram that shows those three elements and the relationship between them, the proposals, the committee, and your remuneration. And within that, the other two key aspects of this, the basis that is set for your remuneration and the value as capped by your fee estimate. So those are the basic principles. Let's move on from there to look at the timetable post-appointment. There are three key decisions that you have to put to creditors following your appointment. First one is the strategy, your proposals. And although creditors have to approve your proposals, that needn't be by a positive vote. It can be by deemed consent, or if you're on a paragraph 52.1 track, it can be by deemed approval. Second of the decisions is a committee. The creditors get to choose whether they want a committee, and if they want a committee, they get to choose who is to sit on it. Again, that's a decision that requires, it's usually a decision not to appoint a committee or not to have people on it, which largely goes by default. You don't actually need a positive vote on that unless there is a decision to form a committee and you're then having to choose the people on it. Third decision is your remuneration, and this you do have to have a positive vote. This can only be done by a decision procedure. You cannot use deemed consent to set the base for your remuneration. So looking at each of those in turn, the rules for the proposals are that you have 8 weeks following your appointment to publish your proposals, and you have 10 weeks to seek approval of them, which may be by deemed consent or a qualifying decision procedure, except for those cases where you don't need approval. And the Cases where you don't need approval, where your proposals will be deemed approved, are those cases that are running on a paragraph 52.1 track. 52.1a is where you think all creditors will be paid in full. So that's a splendid administration where you're having such a good result that you're actually paying all creditors in full and probably thinking about sending some money back to shareholders. 52.1b are the cases at exactly the opposite end of the scale, where the unsecured creditors are getting nothing at all from the administration, just not expecting to realise enough to pay anything to unsecured creditors. For these purposes, you can ignore any distribution that they may be entitled to get through the prescribed part. And the 52.1c track is the most complicated of them. It is where the only possible statutory purpose is the realisation of assets for the benefit of senior creditors, either one or more secured creditors or for the preferential creditors. Now, remember, there are three statutory purposes for administration. The first one is the survival of the company as a going concern. So you've ruled that out. The second one is to get a better result for creditors as a whole through the administration than they would get on a liquidation. So you've ruled that out as well. So you've got an administration where you're actually expecting to do worse for creditors than they would get on a liquidation. And the only basis on which you can continue with administration then is if you are doing it to realise assets for the benefit of secured creditors or preferential creditors. Deemed approval, you get, if you've got a case which is on a paragraph 52.1 track, you've got the right to have your proposals deemed approved, have them approved without a vote. You've also got the right to actually ask creditors expressly to approve them, either through deemed consent or a decision procedure. And if the creditors feel that they are being excluded and want to do something about it, they have got a statutory right to trigger a procedure for you to ask them for express approval of their proposals. Now, I've tried to put this together in a diagram to see if I can make some sense of all of this. So what we've got here is 8 weeks to publish your proposals. And you always have to publish proposals. And most cases, you do need to put the approval of your proposals to the creditors, either through a decision procedure or through deemed consent. But if it's a paragraph 52.1 track case, then you're likely to be able to get your proposals deemed approved without having to put them to the creditors. And you see the demarcation line there running across that slide. It darkens from the date when the proposals are published, and that's because it's the opinion that you state in your proposals that define whether the administration runs on a paragraph 52.1 track or not. And once it's been set on that track, it stays on that track. So those are the three decisions for creditors: proposals, committee, and remuneration. Let's look at the committee. You have to ask creditors if they want to set up a committee. The triggers for that are when you're asking them to approve proposals. That's not triggered if the proposals are being deemed approved. It's only if it's not on the paragraph 52.1 track and you're asking the creditors for approval. You have to invite them to set up a committee at the same time. And if there isn't a committee and you're asking them to decide anything else during the administration, you have to keep repeating the invitation to them to set up a committee if they want to. Now, I've seen a number of administrations where I think this has been done too informally. As I understand the insolvency rules, if ever you have to ask the creditors to decide something, you have to do that by either deemed consent if you're allowed to do it by deemed consent or by a decision procedure. That's what you have to do, unless there is a statutory exception, such as deemed approval for proposals. They're very rare. So I think that if you have to invite creditors to set up a committee, I think you should be doing that through either a decision procedure or a deemed consent notice. And I've seen a number of people who don't do it. I don't think it's that important. I don't think anybody's going to get that excited about, but it's probably easier to comply than not to comply whenever possible. And I suggest that the wording for the resolution should follow the statutory wording, in which case that little word if does some spectacularly heavy lifting, because you can send that resolution out by deemed consent, and although it will be deemed passed, you still don't have a committee unless you've got at least 3 nominations of people willing to act on the committee. So I guess that's possibly the easiest way of doing it. Right, that's committees. What we're all here for is to talk about remuneration. So let's have a look at that. Just in brief summary here, remuneration has to be fixed as either percentage, time cost, or set fee, or a combination of the 3 of them. Creditors are entitled to a lot of detailed information so that they can make an informed decision about it. And here's the bit for lawyers. The basis that is chosen has to reflect those 4 statutory points. Now, nobody will read what you say about them in your proposals, except if it gets to the stage where you're having to go to court to have your remuneration fixed. And at that point, a judge will read those very, very carefully. So although they're boilerplate, although most people aren't interested, they are actually potentially very important. And again, just a quick recap of the basis here. In all cases, you start with the committee if there is one. If there isn't a committee, or if the committee don't set your remuneration, you then move on to the creditors. And in paragraph 52(1) cases, there can be complicated rules about which creditors choose remuneration basis. And if all else fails, you will have to go to court. And final time limit there is an 18-month time limit for going to court. Right, so that's now moving on to the committee. The point I want to make here really is that to a great extent, having a committee is actually optional. Because you should find that because you can control the timing of the decision about appointing a committee, you in effect get the chance to decide whether there is to be a committee at the time when your remuneration is approved. So although you have to start with the committee, in actual fact, you've got quite a lot of discretion, quite a lot of leeway about that. And the main point here is that even if the creditors want a committee and set one up, it still cannot act until it is established. So if you can slip in the resolution before the committee is established, it will be for the creditor as a whole. Now, if there are more than 5 members proposed as members of the committee, I'm not going to talk about this, but I'll be happy to ask questions about that, just because we could get distracted into a bit of a side point on that. So let's move on to look at the different classes of creditors. And there's a couple of points I'd like to make here. First one is the class of secured creditors includes as fixed creditors, creditors who have got rights of ownership of assets. So that would be factoring, hire purchase, leasing, retention of title, and so on. And the other point I would like to make is to remember, of course, that unsecured creditors include not only ordinary unsecured creditors, which are what we normally think about, but preferential creditors are also unsecured creditors. And I think that's potentially something of some importance, quite significant. Let's move on now to look at the different flavours of administrations. One way of categorizing administrations would be by the route into administration. That's not important here. What we need to look at is to identify the creditors who are in the money for the purpose of approving the basis for your remuneration. The basic principle here is that the creditors who are eligible to decide how you are to be paid are the creditors who are most likely to be affected by that decision. And the rules to identify who those creditors are based upon the rules that apply to decide which creditors should be approving your proposals. They're not quite the same. Now, I thought it might be useful to try and set this out as a diagram. So if you can imagine this representing the full range of administrations, and where quality is directly proportional to the result that you get. So bottom left-hand corner, you've got the sorts of administrations you really don't want, where you're not even getting enough realizations to pay your own expenses, let alone distribute anything to creditors. At the other end of the scale, the right-hand edge, you see there the superb, wonderful administrations where not only are you managing to pay all of the creditors all that they are owed, but there's actually some money left over for the shareholders as well. Those cases in the right-hand side where all creditors are being paid in full, those are the paragraph 52(1)(a) cases. The left-hand corner, where you're being able to pay expenses and fixed charge creditors only, there's nothing for the unsecured creditors in those cases. Those are the paragraph 52(1)(b) cases. And those are two of the three paragraph 52(1) tracks where your proposals can be deemed to be approved. Third one, 52(1)(c), is a bit more complicated. For these, we have to compare the result you think you're going to get in the estimated outcome statement published with your proposals. We have to compare that to a hypothetical liquidation of this company. And if the administration is not achieving as good a result for creditors as a whole that the hypothetical liquidation would, then paragraph 52(1)(c) might apply if you can fit within the permitted purpose of the administration of realizing assets for preferential creditors or secured creditors. There's a big overlap between paragraph 52(1)(c) and 52(1)(b). They do describe situations that are very, very similar, and in many cases where 52(1)(c) applies, 52(1)(b) will also apply. And if both apply, then you need to make sure that you tick the box for 52(1)(b) as well as 52(1)(c), because for the purposes of remuneration, 52(1)(b) is the important one. In cases where the administration is giving a better result for creditors than the hypothetical liquidation would, then paragraph 52(1)(c) will not apply, and the only 52(1) tracks that could apply would be A, if you're paying everybody in full, or B, if you're not going to be able to achieve anything for the unsecured creditors, and there is no overlap between those two possible results. And in cases which fall outside any of the three parts of paragraph 52(1), of course, those are the cases where you do have to ask creditors to approve your proposals. Those are the sort of normal cases. So those are the different flavours of administrations that we want to look at. Now let's move on from there to look at the procedure for approving the basis for remuneration. There are some decisions for you. You'll need to work out what basis is the appropriate one for this particular administration. And remember, the law says that has to be justified by reference to those 4 statutory factors. So you'll have to explain that in your proposals. You'll need to decide who you think you would like to have deciding your remuneration in this particular case, whether it's one that you'd like to see the committee work through, or whether you want it to whichever group of creditors are the relevant ones for this particular administration, and that will affect your timetable for circulating your fee estimate. And your fee estimate is the third thing that you will need to decide as well. Because if you're asking for time costs, you will have to prepare a fee estimate, as you know, and that's probably something which conveniently goes into the proposals. So I hope this is now taking shape, the relationship between remuneration, the committee, and the proposals, and the interplay between the 2 factors, the basis and the value, the estimate for your remuneration. This is an outline of how the procedure works. If it is for the creditors to decide rather than the committee, because in all cases, remember, you start with the committee if there is a committee. If it is for the creditors to decide what basis is to apply, it is the creditors in the money who decide. It has to be by a decision procedure. You cannot use deemed consent. And in most administrations, the creditors in the money who decide are the unsecured creditors. And just a reminder that preferential creditors are also unsecured creditors. But the unsecured creditors will not be in the money if it's a paragraph 52(1)(b) case. And that's a case where you said that you outset that you thought that you would be realizing assets only for the benefit of secured or preferential creditors. And in that case, the creditors in the money who vote are the secured creditors by unanimous consent, but only if you're going to be paying them, the prefs by a decision procedure. Now, there's a bit of an obvious contradiction here, between a conflict here between the statutory purpose for administration, which is realizing assets for the benefit of either secured or preferential creditors, and paragraph 52(1)(b), which applies only if there is going to be nothing for unsecured creditors. So paragraph 52(1)(b) will not apply if you're going to be realizing assets, if you think you're going to be realizing assets for the benefit of preferential creditors. It only applies if there is nothing for unsecured creditors, which includes preferential creditors. And there's just a comparison again between 52(1)(b) and 52(1)(c). And that shows the zones here. So essentially, paragraph 52(1)(b) is where the secured creditors fix the remuneration, and possibly the preferential creditors too, but it will apply only if you are realizing assets for the benefit of secured creditors or preferential creditors, and there is actually nothing for preferential creditors. In all other cases, it's for the unsecured creditors to fix the remuneration. So we've got this conundrum about the preferential creditors. How do we work through that? Well, I think the answer to that is to remember that it is what you say in your proposals that will fix the administration on the paragraph 52(1)(b) track. And that will be the opinion that you state at the time when you publish your proposals. And once it's on that track, it stays on that track. So it may be that by the time you're actually asking the creditors to approve the basis for your remuneration, and this could be up to 18 months after your appointment, of course, it might have changed. And perhaps at the outset, you didn't think there were any preferential creditors, and it turns out that actually there are. Or perhaps you've actually done extremely well and you've realized more assets than you thought you would. Let's just look at how the diagram looks if there are no preferential creditors. So that's the basis if you think there are going to be preferential creditors, and essentially it's the fixed charge creditors who are the ones there who are in the money, who are the ones who, if you're only realizing to pay them, that's when 52(1)(b) will apply. If there are no preferential creditors when you put your proposals together, then you'll also be looking at floating charge creditors. So if you're realizing assets for the benefit of fixed and floating charge creditors, you'd still be paying nothing to unsecured creditors because there are no preferential creditors. And so therefore you extend the zone to which paragraph 52(1)(b) applies. So this is then my attempt to put absolutely everything that I've been talking about onto a single slide. So starting from appointment, in all cases you have to publish your proposals within 8 weeks. It is the publication of those proposals, what you say in them at that time, what you think the result will be, that will set the track for the duration of the administration. You have to seek approval for your proposals within 10 weeks, unless it's a paragraph 52(1) track that you've put the administration on, in which case you could get your proposals deemed approved without needing the creditors to approve them. In other cases, you can have your proposals approved by deemed consent or a decision procedure. And then when it comes to deciding your remuneration, for all cases, you have to start with the committee. If it's a paragraph 52(1)(b) case where you are not, where you said at the outset that you did not think there would be any money for the unsecured creditors, then it is the secured creditors who approve your remuneration. In all other cases, it will be the body of creditors as a whole. So hope that makes sense. If all else fails, then you can go to court, and you have got 18 months to go to court. It's a strict time limit. You have 18 months only to go to court. And the sensible thing, if it gets to the stage where you are going to have to go to court, is make one last attempt to try again with a committee, creditors in the money. The judge will want to know what their opinions are about all of this. Right, that's the end of the main presentation itself. Slightly more than 30 minutes, for which I do apologise, but I have got a couple of questions I would like to try and deal with. Now, I've got a question from Nisha. She has said, this is a case where the administrator has made a paragraph 52(1)(b) statement, but you do better than you had originally expected, and there is now going to be a dividend to unsecured creditors. So excellent case, well done. Slap yourself on the back. And the question is, do you then need to have approval from unsecured creditors? And I don't think you do. I think once you have set the administration on a paragraph 52(1)(b) track, then it stays running on a paragraph 52(1)(b) track. So that means it would be the secured creditors and the preferential creditors only who get a vote in it. And if you had to justify it, I suppose it would be because right at the outset, we really didn't think that the unsecured creditors would be in the money. Now we've done tremendously well, and you are actually getting something out of it. But it's still probably fairly borderline, and it's more going to be the preferential creditors and the secured creditors who are at risk of not getting the full 100 pence dividend. So yes, thank you for that question, Nisha. Moving on to the two questions that I had already received in advance. The first of these is, think of a case where you've actually been through all of this process, you've got your proposals approved, you've got the basis for your fees approved, and there's a cost estimate that you're happy with. And then something happens and the statutory purpose for the administration has to change. So perhaps you have a buyer who comes up for whom the only way that paying a spectacularly good purchase price is going to work would be if you were to exit through a CVA, and that's not covered by the statutory purpose that you've got. You're now perhaps looking at payment in full. Whatever the reason might be, you've now got a new statutory purpose for the administration. The nice thing about having questions in advance is I have time to think about them. And what I think the answer to this is that the original basis and estimate remain valid. So if you can still work with the original basis and estimate, you've got the right to do so. If you can't, there are three procedures in the rules that can apply for changing the basis. The first one is that if you think you want to change the whole basis for your remuneration, let's say you'd originally agreed to do it on a fixed fee, and now you're looking at putting together a CVA, you want to move to time costs for that extra work. Then there is a procedure for doing that. If there is a material and substantial case, which I would say there must be if you're actually looking at a completely different purpose. And it's similar to the original basis for fixing your remuneration, and it's the same group of creditors who would fix the new basis as fix the original basis. Second option is in cases where perhaps you're happy to remain on the basis you've got. You perhaps had time costs agreed before, and you're happy with time costs continuing, but it's going to be much more work than you originally thought. There is another procedure that will allow you to draw beyond the original estimate that you gave. So you can go back to creditors and say, look, I'm going to blow through the budget here. Here's a new one. You please approve it. And you can either do that before you start work on the new budget, or you can do it after you've done the work, but you can't do it after you've drawn the extra fees. You have to get the new budget approved before you draw fees. And the third option is if you think the basis or the rate is wrong, you can then ask the creditors to reopen the original decision and review it. Now, this would be the case, I think, where perhaps nothing has actually changed in the administration, but your original fees were based upon an assumption which has turned out, for no fault of your own, to be actually way off beam, and so you need to change that. So I hope that answers that. Second question I've got is, imagine a case where you have the administration fee basis approved with a cost basis, but the original proposal did not envisage exit by a CVL for whatever reason. And then, again, for whatever reason, you're now looking at actually exiting through a CVL. And of course, the additional fees for running the CVL, you didn't give an estimate for that at all because you never expected to be appointed as liquidators under a CVL. Well, what I would do is say, again, it's the same procedure as in the previous answer. You'd look at those three options for expanding the basis for fees that you've already got. And there's a couple of other minor points that I'd raise here in passing. The first one is that you actually don't need express creditor approval to convert, but I think most administrators in this case would want to circulate revised proposals and would ask for them to be approved by creditors, and it would probably make sense to tack the proposal or the resolution for varying the basis for your remuneration or for varying the estimate to that proposal as well. And the second thing is that the existing basis for your remuneration is always carried over into a CVL when an administration is converted into a CVL. So if you had time costs for the original administration, you will still have time costs as the basis for the liquidation as well. So you're only going to need a new basis if the original basis is wholly inappropriate. For example, if the original basis was a fixed fee and simply did not envisage a CVL. Right, so that's now dealt with all of the questions. So I will say thank you all and goodbye. And I hope to see you again next month on the 13th of September, when I will be talking about zombie litigation. Thank you all very much and see you then.